Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Richard Whiteley. I'm the Senior Programs Manager here at the studio of the Corning Museum of Glass. And I'm delighted to join you today and to tell you a little bit about my work and to take you through some of the processes. So I work in cast glass, which is a very slow process. It's kind of like bronze casting, and I often refer to it as bronze casting on Valium because it takes so much time to complete each work. But in the approximately an hour that we have together today, I'm going to take you through some of the surface finishing techniques that I use in my work and show you some of those approaches. These techniques I've been working with for about 25 years. I'm from Australia, and I just joined the team here a couple of months before the pandemic started. And so during the pandemic, the team here at the studio, we adapted a lot of our in-person classes to be delivered online. And I've been working with the team here to adapt some of my demonstrations for that online content. And we're going to use some of that in our presentation today. So this is an older piece of mine. It's about 10 years old. It's a piece of cast glass, which is made by developing a mold. The actual form itself never actually existed until it was cast in glass. And the way I've done this is create an outer mold and an interior mold, this void in the middle here. And they're made in two separate components in a refractory material, and then they're bolted together, and the glass ingots are actually melted into the form. I've put together a couple of slides just so you can visualize that process. So if Jason there can show us slide number 1, that would be really good. I can see that's on the screen now. So that's another really good example of a piece of mine. You can see that interior voided form there. And what I'm trying to do there is get that kind of conversation happening between the interior void and the exterior structure of the form. So what I'm wanting the work to look like is if that interior void is affecting the exterior, as if it's kind of punching out of it. So the casting process gets me a little bit close. If we go to slide 2 there, you can see a mold on the left-hand side there. On the right-hand side, you can see that finished piece. And that mold is, interior voided form is made of material plaster and silica that is mixed up into a block, and then it's carved by hand, and then the exterior form is made by developing a styrene block, and then a 2-layered mold is made over that. If you jump to the next slide, you can see how those components come together. This is quite a large mold. I think it was about 300 pounds of glass that went into this thing. And you can see using those bolts to put those things together. And if we jump to the next slide again, you can see us loading up quite a lot of glass there that gets cast into those molds. And just using reservoirs of flower pots that are cut in half to allow the glass to ooze into that mold. If we jump to the next slide, number 5 there, you can see that whole thing at hot top temperature. That's about 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, about 850 degrees centigrade. So it's quite toasty. And then it takes a ridiculous amount of time to cool down to room temperature. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But if we can drop out of the slides now, I'll take you through a little more of the processes that we're going to cover today. So this finishing technique, as you saw through the slides, the pieces come out of the molds and they're pretty raw. None of this detail. If I turn this a little bit sideways for you, you can see there's a kind of a carved element there. That's all put in, all that kind of detail is put in after the piece is cast. When this is cast, it's lying down on its back and it comes out of the mold flat. So all of this material around here is being carved away. And why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just cast this in here beforehand? And the reason for that is that it's very hard to predict how the light will work through the material. So I find the carving process quite intrinsic to developing the finished work. I do spend a lot of time making models. I've got these little samples of models that I make to help visualize some of the ideas that I'm thinking about. But they only really give me a starting point. Because this is a non-transparent material and glass is inherently transparent, and I want to explore that relationship between interior and exterior. This is like a sketch. And so I don't just make this into a large form and know that's going to work. I often have to work with the carving process and change things as I go along. So that's why there's a lot of finishing at the end. And this surface is all done by hand. When I was a student, I studied with Klaus Moyer, who was a German migrant to Australia, who started the glass program at the School of Art and Design in Canberra at the Australian National University. And when I was a first-year student, he told us that when your glass comes out of the annealer, after you've formed it, if you're a glass blower, a kiln caster, or a kiln former, he said it is just a blank. And that's when the real work starts, when the conversation with the cold working process can really change and accentuate a form. And I took that advice very literally. And as my work developed, I spent a lot of time in that kind of post casting process in really developing the personality of the piece. So what I thought would be a really good thing to show you today is this finishing technique to get to this really kind of matte sheen surface, because that is very hard to do without an acid bath, but the acid that's used to finish glass is very corrosive and it's very dangerous. So we developed these techniques to create this matte surface, and I want to share that with you today. So the piece that we're going to work on today is this one that I was developing for a class. We had an online 10-week class which went really well, and this was a piece that I worked with the students over that 10-week period. And what you can see here is two pieces of glass that have been cast. You might be able to see the seam between them there. A little bit hard to pick up on the camera, but not too bad. There we go. So this is two pieces of cast glass which have been glued together and then shaped. And they're subtly different colours. A little bit hard to pick up in this light, but there's a grey and there's a slight green. And when this came out of the kiln, this was flat on this surface here. And what I've done is I've dug out, I've developed that concave form. I knew I would do something like that, but I needed to, as I said earlier, cast the glass to get a sense of what curvature I wanted to achieve. So to do that, to rough that out, I use these kind of tools. These are tools that a regular stone carver would use, and they are diamonds embedded in a metal alloy. Basically, it's a sintered tool, and it fits onto a little coupling unit like that, and you would use it with an air tool like this. Traditionally, glass artists would make a form and then they would lift that form up to a wheel to shape it. But with my work, it's too heavy. I can't hold this for more than a couple of minutes before my forearms would fail. So I have to take the grinding tool to the piece of glass itself. So these kind of tools are really helpful for doing that rough shaping. I've also done the outside of that form with this tool, and it'll get me pretty close. However, it won't get it really perfectly accurate. And you can see there's a really nice curve in here now. That has not been created with these tools. That's a very rough tool, which would leave, it's about the equivalent of about a 30 grit diamond. So it's very scratchy. I then go through it with these kind of tools, which are resin bonded, again for the stone industry. Glass very much behaves like a stone when you're carving it. In fact, the Egyptians referred to it as a poured stone. That was the language they used to describe glass when they were forming it. So these resin bonded discs are again pretty good, but the real kind of detail work here is created just by using pieces of glass, grinding glass against glass. It's the perfect way to get really accurate forms. So that's what I'm going to start with today. I'm not going to take you through these roughing processes because, well, that would be too noisy and it would splash all the camera equipment in here, and I wouldn't be very popular with the team. So I'll take you through this process and I'll take you through some of these finishing techniques. So what we've done here, I'll take it over here so we can get started on it. I've just got a little piece of styrene in the bottom here, so that keeps it all nice and neat. And what I've done here is I've just used, as I said, a little piece of glass, and I'm going to grind it against the surface here. So to do that, I've got this 400 grit, and this is silicon carbide grit. It just comes in a powder form. And when I started on it, I was using 80 grit, and I was using a larger piece of glass. This is a little bit small. I was just using this offcut, this large slab of offcut glass. It's actually a softer glass than this. This is a lead glass, and the nice thing about that is that it conforms to this shape very, very quickly. You know, after about sort of 20 minutes of grinding, this shape and this shape marry together very nicely. But I've gone through that process, and what I want to do now is take some of the 400 grit I'm just going to take some of this 400 grit powder. I've just got it in some water here. So if we just come up and look at the glass now. So I've got some of that in there, and I'm just going to take my little bit of glass. I'm just going to start grinding. So I've already done a little bit of this before we started today, and you can see a couple of little marks around the edges where I've missed a spot. So I'm just working those in and spending some time getting the surface nice and even. So it's literally just the glass on glass that is giving me this really even surface. It's surprising just how accurate the glass can be. When I started grinding with the 80 grit and I was using this large piece of glass, it wasn't even ground to the same shape as this, but it just evened itself out very quickly as I'm grinding it around the surface here. Another addition, I'll go back to using my small bit of glass, but another addition to the grit, other than just a little bit of water, is a little bit of detergent. You can see there's sudsing in there. So this 400 grit is more, it just makes the grit less sticky, and there's less opportunity for the glass to cause a suction and get pulled into the surface. So dishing that out, as I said, this was flat when I started. Dishing that out, that took about half an hour or so of heavy grinding, and little chips of glass were flying everywhere. So I was doing that in a cold working booth, so glass didn't spray all over the studio. And then I moved to that large piece of glass and I used an 80 grit just to establish that nice even curve. And from that 80 grit, once I was happy with that, I moved to 220 before using this 400 grit. So there's a series of steps that you go through. In all, it's probably taken about 3 hours of work to establish this surface. And because I'm grinding 400 grit glass to glass, there's a hard surface here pushing against a hard surface there. So the grit is silicon carbide, it gets trapped in the middle and it abrades both this surface and this surface. So what we'll do now is we'll stop and we'll take a look at this surface. I'll just give it a bit of a rinse. I'll just dry that off. Just use the compressed air for a second. And you can see that it looks pretty silky on that camera work. There we go, that's a pretty good angle of it. You can see there's a nice even surface there. That certainly didn't just take the 5 minutes that I took then to establish that. That took about 30 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes of grinding, constantly putting fresh grit on. But it really is just the glass on glass, and it gives you that really beautiful, even finish. But what I want to do is, from that previous example that I showed you, that I have at the other end of the table, you can see there's kind of a silky satin finish to that. Which is really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for not this kind of matted surface. I'm looking for more of a silky surface. So I need to go through some more steps now to bring up that final finish. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm still going to use the same grit, but I'm going to switch, instead of using glass on glass, I'm going to use emery paper. So this is just 400 grit emery paper that you would get from the hardware store. It's really a cheap material, and all that does is help us push the 400 grit across the surface. The backing part of that, the thing that's going to push it across the surface, is my hand. And my skin is much softer than the glass itself, so that'll give us a very different finish. So to do that, all I do is I take my sheet of paper, and I've figured out just folding it into thirds seems to be a good way to do it. Fold it in like this, and then cut it into 4 pieces. And then what I also do is I just cut the ends off, cut the corners off. Now the reason I do that, the reason I cut the corners off, is that sometimes when you're using it, this sharp little corner there can tag into your piece and leave a little bit of a scratch. So to avoid that, I just do that. Now I've got these 3 layers that are all folded in on themselves. And all this is really a medium to help push the grit across the surface. And my hand, my soft little fingers here, are going to be the backing pad. I'm only going to do half of it so you can see the difference in tone. So again, I'm just going to take some of my 400 grit, which is just the 400 silicon carbide mixed with water and a little bit of detergent. I'm going to take one of my pieces of emery paper and I'm just going to grind that surface. Just going to sit that in there. Now I'm looking for a nice even finish. What will happen is the paper will wear out very, very quickly where my fingers were. So every 20 seconds or 30 seconds, I'm just going to move my fingers a little bit further across the emery paper. And after you've done this for a few hours, you can feel the texture changing under your hand, and so you know it's time to move your fingers. So once you've finished with one side, then you flip it over and you do it on the other side. That's a little bit hard to show you when it's done on the camera, but when I get a minute to take a break here, I'll rinse that emery paper and you can see just how it's wearing as I'm pushing it around. So the important thing to remember when you're cold finishing is it's not only the grit that you're using, it's also how the grit is combined. So early on in this process, I showed you the diamond tool, and that holds the diamonds rigid in a metal matrix. Here I'm using silicon carbide, and that's softer, quite a bit softer than the diamond, and it's got a soft backing pad in my hand. Both of those things make a huge difference. So let's just have a look at that emery paper. You can see there, if we can zoom in on that little bit of paper. There we go. You can see my little finger marks, and that's where it's worn out. So we want to keep that moving around. We want the grit to be constantly being pushed around on the surface, and that emery paper is a really good way to do it, but it will only do that for a little while. I was talking to some colleagues in Japan. These techniques, there was some colleagues in Canberra who I was working with for a few years, and we all kind of just shared information and came up with this little process. And I was talking to some colleagues in Japan who had come up with a very similar process, except instead of using emery paper, they use little pieces of hard plastic. Plastic that's similar to these containers here. They just cut it up into small pieces and then use that. And that plastic abrades a little bit on the surface and holds the grit to push it across the surface. So it's really interesting talking to colleagues who've come to very similar processes, but just change things ever so slightly. So let's have a look at that. We'll give that another little rinse off. Might have to just wash my hands a bit. And we'll see how that looks. May be able to pick that up on the camera. So I don't know how well that's going to show, but that's a lot. There you go. You see there's a little bit more sheen onto this side here. A little bit hard to see, but it's a little matter on this side here than it is on this side here. A little bit hard to pick that up. You can just see it there. It's a little bit more subtle. It's obviously more obvious here because I can see the contrast. But it'll become clearer as we go through those final two steps. So I would spend probably another 10 or 15 minutes doing that with the emery paper before I moved to another medium. Still using the 400 grit, But then what I would do is I would go to this sponge. Let me just show you what that is. So that's just an industrial sponge that I get from the hardware store, and it's this soft scourer. Basically the green scourers that you would know that you get from the supermarket, they're a little bit rough, and so I use this slightly softer plastic sponge that I get from the hardware store. You can often get the blue sponges as well, but the green ones are a little bit more aggressive, but these white ones seem to be really good. Again, all it is a medium for holding the grit and pushing it across the surface. It's important that it's soft and it yields and it lets the grit tumble across the surface. So let's give that a go. I'll cut off a little piece here. Don't need quite that large a piece. And we'll just take some more 400 grit. We'll just rub that into the surface. When I was refining this process, this is technically not a new process. Artists over the years have developed techniques for finishing their surfaces. But I was using a microscope to analyze the surface of the glass just to see what effect each of the grits and each of the processes was having. I've got an image that I'll show you. Jason, if we can bring up slide number 7. You can see there on the left-hand side, that's the glass-on-glass grinding. That's why it's called 400 grit with a hardback. You can see the magnification there in the bottom left-hand corner. And so what's that showing you is how rough that is when you're grinding a hard surface against a hard surface. In the middle, what you can see is when I'm using the same grit, but I'm using a plastic pad, which is a soft back, and that is making a huge difference. And that's pushing the grit gently into all those different crevices and almost buffing it. And then the final one is the process that we're yet to do, and that is the pumice. So that's a softer material again. It's a pre-polished material used in the glass industry. For over 2,000 years, the Egyptians and the Romans used pumice as a lapidary tool on their glass and stone. And you can see there where it's really gone into those pores and made it look quite matte. And that is the finish of my pieces. So let's pop back to a piece of glass. While we were looking at that, I just rinsed this off. And you can start to see more clearly now that difference. This here is really starting to shine up. There you go. You can see that divide where this half is still quite matte, and this half here is really starting to get that sheen. Oops, sorry about that. I knew that would happen. So you can see that really starting to transform there. There is one more step, and I do want to show that to you, because that is that final step there. Okay, so that's the second step. After the hard 400, we've used the 400 and the emery paper, and then we've used the 400 and this little sponge. The very final step is to introduce a new material, and that's that pumice that I was just talking about. So this is a fine pumice. It's quite a soft material. I'm just going to rinse my hands to make sure I don't put 400 grit in the pumice bucket. I will be the most unpopular person in the cold shop if I do that. And it's just, again, a powdered pumice that's worked into a slurry. You can see it here in my hands. So I'm just going to put it on this one side. Again, I'm just using that cleaning sponge. I think those sponges were designed for mops. I know a cold working demo is not like watching a hot glass demo. Us cold workers live in a different universe to the hot glass workers. Their demonstrations are always very exciting. There's lots of flame. Our demonstrations can be like watching paint dry. But there you go. The important thing is just keep it moving. Try not to spend too long in one spot. You can overdo this process. You can create too much of a sheen and it gets a little bit blotchy. So I try wherever possible just to do what is needed rather than overdoing it. So let's have a look at that. Just a little bit of compressed air. Still a little bit of pumice on there, a little veneer. Let's get that off. So let's hold that up. And you can really start to see the difference there. That really is starting to shine up and become quite a sheen. And that's how I finish my work. That's how I finish all the surfaces. If you, Jason, you can jump back to slide 7 again. You can see those finishes. We've transformed pretty quickly from that 400 grit. Remember, this is a magnified view of that grit. 400 is a very fine grit. But all the way through to the pumice with the plastic pad. It gives you a really robust surface that is resistant to fingerprints, and it also doesn't use any chemicals. So some artists use products like liquid luster and other commercial finishing products. This is a natural finish, and it's just a glass finish. So there's a lot of advantages to this. The archival issues of using Armor All and liquid luster are quite complex, and so this is a much better way to go if you at all can. Jason, if you can back up to slide number 6, you can see quite a large piece that I finished in my studio a few years ago, and that's a very large work. Took several of us to move it, but that piece uses the same finishing techniques that I've just shown you there. So let's drop out of that, and I'll show you another technique now. On this edge, use my trusty little chopsticks to hold the piece in place here. I just want to show you this edge. I think we've got a good camera shot of that. So this is obviously finished to a much rougher level. This is still at 80 grit. So as I was making this piece, I was using literally this piece of glass, and to get it even, after I'd used the air tools, I just ground a piece of glass on the edge of it using 80 grit. And you might think that would take a month of Sundays to get that piece finished, but it actually only took about an hour and a half to go around this whole edge and get it finished. As I'm doing it, I can see where the bumps are, and I'm literally grinding the glass over those bumps. But it evens out pretty quickly. this piece of glass, you can still see the little divot in the middle from where this took on, eventually this took on the shape of this edge. I'm not worried that the two pieces of glass don't match. I'm going to use this piece of glass again on this edge. But getting that even is surprisingly quick, and it's much more accurate than using air tools or other things, just by grinding it by hand. And it may seem very pedestrian and very slow, but it is actually very accurate. The Czechs still do a lot of their finishing by hand, and so do many other colleagues around the world. To make sure it's even, I find it easier, rather than looking at the surface, just to rub my hand over it, and I can feel the very subtle bumps, if there were any, under my fingertips, and then I can just go back and continue to grind. So what I wanted to show you on this particular surface was another finishing technique. And here what I wanted to do was leave this 80 grit, leave some of the pock marks in there from the 80, but take away a lot of the whiteness and just give you like a satin finish over the top. So to do that, instead of doing what I did on the other surface, which was grind 80 grit, 220 grit, and then 400 grit, I'm just going to go straight from 80 grit all the way to 400. So let's start with that. Bring up a little more 400 grit. Put that on the surface. I can use my big bit of glass if I want. And what I'm trying to do is grind out some of the 80, but not all of it. It's a little bit harder to control. So I'll switch to this slightly smaller piece of glass here that I was using on the front. And the secret with this particular technique of a matted 80 finish is just to keep it even, more so than the steps I was just showing you on the front. If I kept going with this technique, if I was to grind here for a few hours, I would actually grind all the way through the 80. It's not advisable, but technically you can skip a grit if you're patient, but it's usually quicker to step through the grits in a more formal way, checking it each time you go through to make sure that you have thoroughly ground the remnants of the previous grit away. So let's have a look at that and see how that's coming up. I'll just give that a little bit of a rinse. Normally I have a hose to do that, but we're in a studio here where a little bit hard to spray water around with all these cameras. So what you can see here, you see how it's gone from a full white to a semi-white finish. It's quite a bit different to, it's not really showing up there very well. It's whiter down there than it is up on this corner. We're just starting to slowly build in a little bit of the 400 grit. It needs a little bit more. There you go, that's a better shot of it. And it's starting, you still see those 80 pock marks in there, but you're starting to see a matte surface come over the surface. We'll do that for a few more minutes, and then we'll take you through the last couple of steps. Quite often these are quite flat shapes or even curves, and grinding glass on glass is a really easy way to affect the surface. If I was trying to make a more of a acute angle, like on the surface of the piece that I showed you at the beginning of class, that would require a slightly different piece of glass or a different shape to help me get that form. So for that I use diamond pads and other tools that I purpose make. We customize to fit those surfaces. So there you're starting to see, I can probably show you a little better on this surface here. So you can see that how it's quite white there, and then around here we're getting more of a matte finish. So to take that all the way through, the final parts that I'll do is exactly what I was doing before. I'll just use the sponge and the 400 grit again. And that really gets into that surface. Whereas the glass can't get down into the pores, this softer material conforms to the shape much more quickly. So let's have a look at that and see how it's coming along. So let's have a close-up of that. So you can see it's a little bit white down here, but up in here it's working really well. So the final step is to use that pumice again. And that's how I'm going to close out that surface. So you can experiment with a number of different tools and techniques to get these finishes. Just needs a little bit of water on there to rinse it. So let's dry that off and have a look. You can see there that really nice matte, still got a little bit of a pockmark surface to it, but over on this side here you can see how much starker and wide it is and flat it is. It almost looks like a sandblast. I really don't like sandblasted surfaces, but if you want to experiment with sandblasted surfaces as well, you can do this same technique. You can put a sandblast on there and then go back with the emery paper and the pumice. So they're just a couple of techniques of how to finish surfaces and how to bring up pieces to finish them without using chemicals or anything like that. And I've used, as I say, a lot of different tools over the years. If we just step back here, here are some. This is like your standard diamond pad that again you'd buy from a stone supplier or an art glass supplier, and that's got a little diamond impregnated sheet on it, and it's flexible and you can buff it around a lot of different surfaces. But that'll give you quite a scratched surface. It's pretty good at evening things out, but it will give you a scratched surface. So I always finish that with the grits. Here are just a couple of different tools that we've made. Taking one of these and just slicing it up and reforming it to get into a curve, or a shape like this where we've just taken this sheet material that we can buy and then hot glued it around the edge. And that's the kind of thing, if we step over here, that I would use to get these kind of angles on this surface here. You can zoom into that. I don't want to get it too close and scratch it, but those kind of tools are used for that final shaping and getting that surface to finish. There you go, you can see that there a little more clearly. So that's all carved by hand and all finished with the techniques that I've shown you today. Before we go, I did want to show you a couple more things. I'm just going to have to spin around to the other part of the studio. I'll take that out of there so it doesn't fall. Quite often artists have pieces come out of the kiln and they don't want to spend even that amount of time doing that finishing work. So a cast surface can often have these kind of blotches on it, these kind of little marks here from the casting process, or little imperfections. And a number of artists have asked over the years about how to blend that in. You might be able to see that on there. There's just a little bit of kind of scum on that surface and then these little bits of tooling marks. This is just a piece that's come out of the kiln and I've just started to flatten this surface. There's still a fair amount of cold working to be done on this particular material already. But another way to do it is just to take these sandflex blocks, which are just rubber blocks with aluminum oxide impregnated in them. They're, again, from a lapidary supplier. I was visiting a supplier in Sydney, Australia, and he said, give these a go. You're always trying to experiment with different tools. And these are quite cheap. They're available on the internet. They're called sandflex blocks. And they're just the same, very similar material to the silicon carbide, but it's just in a rubber block. And you can use that to just buff the surface of your glass. So if we have a look at this little surface here, you can see this kind of schmutz, technical term, schmutz, on the surface there. If I just give it a little bit of a buff with one of these blocks, it can really just blend it in. And that only takes, as you can see, a couple of moments, and then it's a little bit matted, but there are a finer block that I can use to even out those surfaces. So it's just a bit of a cheat, and it's a really great way to finish up some surfaces. I often use it. Here's another piece that we've been working on. This is commission work for a designer from the Netherlands called Aldo Baker. And this is, in fact, if we punch to slide number 8 there, Jason, we'll be able to see that this is a collaboration that we've been doing over the last year with Aldo Baker and Annika Torell from J Hill Standard in Ireland. And they came to us and said, look, we're trying to manufacture this little creamer, but we can't figure out how to do it, and could you help us with that? And so we spent a bit of time doing some R&D for them, and came up with this moulding technique, which I'll show you in a minute. But if we just jump back to the regular camera, the technique that we came up with leaves these seams on the surface, and we use an air tool to blend those out. But one of the ways we can then unify the surface before this thing gets acid polished, this is cast in Waterford crystal, is just use these little emery blocks to finish and unify the surface. So that gets it down to, we use finer ones, and that gets it down to about 1500 before we do that final polish. That project, I might talk to you about that just for a minute. That casting project that you just saw was quite complicated, because what they were trying to do is to make this particular form with the hollow core in it, and it's quite a delicate little hollow core in the middle. So what we did is we asked the designer to make the interior as a positive. And it's very similar to the way that I make my own work. We made the negative as a positive. So that's this form here. We made a retrievable mold out of that, and then we cast this in a high quality, commercially made casting investment material. We experimented with a lot of different materials, but the only one that held up was the one that made, that could hold this little join here. And then we made the rest of the form in these two molds here, if we can get a close-up of that. And these two little forms here are two components of molds that this sits in between, like that, and then this other section screws over the top, and then the glass is placed up here and it casts into the mold. And we can get it every time now. It just took a little while to figure out that process of positive and negative. And J. Hill Standard asked us to come up with a system that systematized the process that it could be put into production. So that's just happening at the moment. And we're just running a series of small run of commissions for them to get this product launched. I think Aldo and Annika launched this product in London just a few weeks ago. So we're really happy to be involved in that project. Anyway, so that's a little bit about our work. I know we're fast coming up to time, but I wanted to thank everyone for tuning in, and I don't know if we've got any questions. I think Harry's been able to answer all the questions as they've come in, but thank you all for your time and watching our live stream today.